They say every grave holds a story, and some stories refuse to die. In most cemeteries, silence reigns supreme, cold and eternal. But there's a place where silence is broken, where the dead answer questions they were never supposed to. If you're brave enough to listen, the whispers will find you. Welcome to this unsettling tale of the Grave Talks, where speaking with the dead may be the last conversation you ever have. Anya had always been drawn to the paranormal, chasing mysteries and odd encounters like someone addicted to answers no one wanted. She wasn't afraid of the dark or the eerie unknown. That's what made her different, and some might say, reckless. So, when she heard rumors about an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place where the dead were said to whisper back to the living, she couldn't resist. The stories were strange, the kind that felt more like urban legends told to scare children. They said people who dared to talk to the graves, really talk, would get answers. Not just whispers, but specific, unsettling truths. It was said that not everyone who visited the cemetery came back the same. Some returned with a haunted look in their eyes as if they'd seen things they couldn't unsee. Others never returned at all. Anya told herself it was just folklore, but a nagging curiosity clawed at her mind, and she knew she had to go, if only to prove to herself that there was nothing to be afraid of. With her voice recorder in hand and her car parked outside the cemetery gates, she made her way through the overgrown paths under the cover of a cloudy October night. The gate creaked behind her as it swung shut, locking her inside the forgotten resting ground. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. A dense canopy of trees blocked out the moonlight, leaving everything draped in shadows. Anya felt the weight of the place immediately, as though the air itself carried stories too heavy to lift. She wandered among the graves, scanning the worn-out stones until one caught her eye. The inscription read, Eleanor Finch, 1903-1937. Taken too soon. The simplicity of it gave Anya chills. She had always found that the shortest epitaphs carried the most tragedy. This would be the first grave she'd speak to. Kneeling before the weathered stone, she clicked on her recorder and leaned in. Eleanor Finch, she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind rustling through the dead branches. I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I'd like to talk to you. The wind stopped abruptly, as if nature itself had leaned in to listen. Anya's skin prickled. She licked her lips, uncertain whether to continue, but she pressed on. I read that you were a school teacher. They say you were kind, loved by the kids, but it also said that your death was suspicious. Curiosity got the better of her. She leaned in closer to the grave and whispered, Eleanor, who did it? Who hurt you? The air grew impossibly still, heavy with something unseen but present. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then she heard it, clear and unmistakable, a soft whisper right behind her ear. Don't turn around. Anya's stomach dropped. Her muscles locked, paralyzed with fear. She could feel something, or someone, standing right behind her. The voice came again, dry as old leaves. He's still here, watching. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. Her mind screamed at her to get up, to run, but her body refused to obey. Slowly, as if moving through thick syrup, she turned her head toward the sound. There was no one there, just rows of silent graves stretching into the night. Anya stumbled back, her breath hitching, heart pounding in her chest. She knew she needed to leave, and fast. Grabbing her recorder, she muttered a quick apology to Eleanor's grave and turned to make her way back to the gate. But as she took her first step, she heard the voice again, this time from the recorder, playing on its own. He's coming for you now. Anya's blood ran cold. She bolted, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the tombstones as she sprinted through the cemetery. The gate loomed ahead, and she threw herself through it, slamming it shut behind her. Safe inside her car, she locked the doors and sat in stunned silence, heart still hammering in her chest. After a few moments, she dared to play back the recording again. But what she heard was worse. The recording started with a faint hum, the background noise of a cold, windy night. And then, beneath the static, there was something else, faint breathing. It wasn't her own. It was heavy and deliberate, as though something monstrous was trying to suppress its excitement. She listened, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to make sense of the sounds. Then came the whisper, as clear as if someone was sitting in the passenger seat beside her. "You shouldn't have left, Anya. You asked, and now you'll know." Her heart stopped. How did the recording know her name? She hadn't said it aloud at the cemetery, hadn't introduced herself to Eleanor's grave. She threw the recorder onto the passenger seat in panic, as if the plastic device had suddenly become toxic. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. "It's just a prank. Someone could have tampered with the graves. It's just a trick." But deep down, she knew it wasn't a trick. Something had followed her from the cemetery, something that wasn't bound to stone and soil. She could feel it sitting with her now, in the cramped, silent space of her car, watching her with an ancient and malevolent patience. It moved too fast to be an animal, too deliberate to be anything living. Anya's skin crawled. The road ahead seemed to stretch longer and darker, and for a moment she wasn't sure if she was even on the same road anymore. Her headlights caught something in the distance. A figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. It was tall, gaunt, and utterly motionless, as though it had been waiting just for her. Anya slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched as the car skidded to a stop just inches from the figure. Her heart raced as her trembling hands fumbled to shift the car into reverse. But the figure didn't move. It wasn't until she stared at it that she recognized its shape. The pale face, sunken eyes, and lifeless expression. It was Eleanor Finch. But this wasn't the Eleanor from photographs. The figure standing before her was decayed. Her skin stretched tight over bones, her dress tattered and filthy with dirt. And then Eleanor smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that spread far too wide across her gaunt face. Anya screamed, slamming the gear into reverse and flooring the gas. The car lurched backward, but the tires spun helplessly, as if the ground beneath her had turned to sludge. Eleanor tilted her head, her dead eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "You asked," Eleanor whispered, though her mouth barely moved. "Now you'll know." Suddenly, the car's interior lights blinked off, plunging everything into darkness. Anya's breath hitched, her pulse thundering in her ears. The air around her grew suffocatingly cold, and she felt something brush against her neck, light and deliberate, like the touch of brittle fingers. She twisted in her seat, trying to see through the darkness. Something was in the car with her now, breathing in sync with her own frantic gasps. It was so close that she could smell the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers. Then she heard it again. "I see you." Anya's mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her body felt paralyzed with terror. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock clicked shut with an eerie finality. Just as she was about to lose all hope, the headlights flickered back on. The road was clear. Eleanor's figure was gone. The car jerked forward, the tires suddenly finding traction. Anya hit the gas and sped away without looking back. Her house was only a few miles away, but it felt like hours before she reached it. She parked haphazardly in the driveway, threw open the door, and stumbled out, gasping for air. The night was still and quiet, as if nothing had happened at all. But the silence felt too perfect, too unnatural. She rushed inside, slamming the door behind her, locking it with every bolt and chain she had. Safe in her living room, she allowed herself to breathe. The recorder sat forgotten on the passenger seat of her car. At least, she hoped it was forgotten. She never wanted to hear its contents again. Just as she began to calm down, her phone buzzed. A notification. With shaking hands, she picked it up. The screen showed a single audio message from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold as she tapped to play it. The message was only a few seconds long, but it was enough to freeze her soul. "I'm already inside." Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, dreading what she might see. In the dim light of her living room, something shifted, just out of view. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with eyes like hollow pits. It smiled, a terrible grin that stretched across its decayed face. It wasn't Eleanor, it was something far worse. The lights flickered once, and then everything went dark. You asked the dead to talk, but some conversations can't be ended.